possibility of social unrest and things like that, not only in poorer, more vulnerable countries, but in all countries as a result of some of these risks is really sobering and interesting. And I'm curious what you see, if anything, that can be done to try to stem those risks now. What are the things you would like to see happening that would help to reduce those risks?
Thanks for that. Carolina, you mentioned that. Do you want to come in on it?
Yes, sure. I think it is really about rebuilding trust in governmental systems and public. That's a big and important part of it, but I think it's not easy because governments are now battling and managing so many risks at the same time, and of course focus needs to be on managing the crisis in the short term, but I do think there are things that governments can do to reduce the cost of living crisis, to mitigate for some of those impacts, but at the same time the trade-off is that you then might lose sight of the longer term risks, and I think that is the trick in balancing the longer term with the shorter term at this point in time. But I do think it comes back to rebuilding trust and really making sure that, because that is the foundation.
So any of the other panelists want to come in? We've got quite a few questions to get through. Sadia.
Maybe just adding a little to that. I think refocusing on building resilience in core systems that are important for society, education, health, basic aspects around job security and support for job transitions during the midst of this sort of economic transformation period. All of those things are critical, especially in some of the advanced economies where these things are getting weakened. But equally so, I think global cooperation is important, even though these seem like very local risks, because in many developing and emerging markets, it is going to require international support to provide more of that stability, especially with such a large number of countries in debt distress at present.
Thanks for that. Working our way across, gentleman on the end there.
Hi, John Paul Ford from the Daily Mail. Your press release mentions one of the risks being war. Can you identify any hotspots? I think a lot of people I've spoken to recently talk about the risk of the war around Taiwan being a major risk that could tip things further into a more gloomy situation the year ahead.
Thanks for that. Does anyone want to kick off on, are there specific areas that are identified in the report?
So we're actually looking at global risks, broadly speaking, and trying to understand where people are putting their relative severity. And what's interesting is that the experts that have responded to the survey are actually putting traditional geopolitical risks, such as traditional warfare, further down than, for example, geoeconomic confrontation and geoeconomic warfare, as well as cyber warfare. So I think the nature of how conflict happens is changing. That's one key thing that's coming out of the survey. And a second element at the same time is that doesn't mean that we shouldn't at the same time be concerned, because for the first time in a fairly long time, military spending is seeing a small but pronounced uptick in many large economies. And so there is possibly a future risk here that we do need to be thinking about.
Yes, and if I can add, I also want to highlight the fact that infectious disease ranked so low, both on short and long-term risk. And I think the link to war is that if infectious diseases were to be weaponized, I think there's also a massive risk to how we perceive war and what that could look like in terms of the impact on the world.
John?
Yeah, and I think, Sadia's point about the geoeconomic warfare, I think, interstate war and a hot war, we're clearly experiencing one in Europe right now, the first time in 80 years. But there are hotspots around the rest of the world. But I think largely a lot of the competition between countries is geoeconomic. I think also in the technological space, we wrote last year, in fact, a lot about competition in space and actually the way that warfare can extend into domains outside of the obvious hot warfare in individual countries or regions. So I think that's a thing that has big risk implications, especially in terms of cyber risks.
Thanks for that. if we work back on that side, I think we've just got a microphone behind you. Thanks.
Thank you. John Guy, Emerging Risk. I'd just like to ask the insurance team on the panel. You mentioned climate change, you mentioned the fact that it's moving from mitigation to adaptation. But obviously for the insurance industry, you know, we're seeing greater severity, greater frequency of major losses. Do you envisage a time, if we are going to go down the adaptation rather than mitigation route, that the insurance industry is going to have to draw a line and say, I'm sorry, but, you know, we are going to have to start marking, you know, some risks and some areas as simply uninsurable? I
think the insurance industry is really coming to the fore. In fact, the whole financial services sector in the last couple of COPs, and in particular in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, there was a lot on the adaptation. Obviously, the one that headlines was the agreement on loss and damage. But equally, there was a lot of work with the Insurance Development Forum, the IDF, which is a group that was set up in 2015 after the Paris Agreement to really look at how to share some of the modelling capabilities that sit within the insurance industry to help not only companies but countries model natural catastrophe risks and how they may change over time with the influence of climate change. So I think, you know, the whole adaptation agenda and the building of resilience is so much built into what insurance does. I mean, one of the purposes of insurance is to create resilience in societies in all sorts of ways, for individuals, in life insurance, for companies and for countries in terms of commercial insurance and municipal insurance. So I think the whole resilience piece and the adaptation piece is an obvious place where the insurance industry can play its part.
And if I can just add a couple of comments on that, my perspective is, of course, as a representative of a risk consultant and insurance broker, but I would say that the whole chain, the importance of the whole chain has really increased. And what I mean by that is not only about the risk transfer piece, but it's really about the risk identification, the risk mitigation, the risk management, the strategies, connecting strategy to risk. And then at the end of it, you might end up in a risk transfer situation. But I do think companies are starting to realize that the importance in making mitigating efforts, in actually being willing to invest upfront in order to become insurable has increased over time. And we see that in a couple of different areas. And I would point to NatCat and cyber, for example, where there's also a huge opportunity going forward for public-private partnerships to close some of those protection gaps that have arisen as an impact of the fact that the world is so interconnected and incredibly volatile and dramatic.
Thanks for that. Working our way over the other side of the room. Should we start on gentleman at the front? Oh, we're starting at the back. Okay.
Thanks very much. Richard Partington from The Guardian. One of the speakers mentioned how we were living in a world where what's scientifically necessary and what's politically expedient don't match. I wondered if you might add a third to that, and what makes short-term business sense being part of the problem, and that profitability for large corporations is an issue which can blind the need to invest or mitigate climate change. I give, for example, large dividends being paid out by energy companies and efforts by one particular company to sue the European Union over a windfall tax proposal. Are companies doing sufficient measures in the short term to tackle climate change, and would you not say that more needs to be done?
Thanks for that. John, you actually made that point.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think, you know, there's a lot of challenge at the moment around greenwash and green hush. You know, companies not wanting to talk about what they're doing because they're afraid of litigation. But I think the reality is solving climate change is kind of like the ultimate team sport. It isn't just coming from one sector. So it has to be governments, it has to be business, it has to be the finance sector working together to really address these really complex and systemic issues. And what I observe is there's an awful lot of companies saying they're doing really good things. They've got transition plans that they've published. They disclose through the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework what they plan on doing. And I think I have a lot of optimism that if those plans get implemented, if government nationally determined reduction commitments are implemented, and government long-term strategies are implemented, that we will get to a world that is getting close to the 1.7 or below 2 degree objectives of the Paris Agreement. That doesn't say we shouldn't be keeping up the pressure on companies to keep delivering. And I think it's really important. I think the finance sector has a really important role here, especially in the investment space, to make sure that companies deliver on what they say they're going to do in their transition plans.
And Sadi, we're seeing a little bit of pushback, aren't we, against that role that finance companies might be starting to play versus the energy sector. If you look at the stakeholder metrics pushback, is there a divergence between what companies ought to be doing and what they say they'd like to do?
Yeah, I think it's again back to the sort of putting on the short and the medium term lenses. I think overall the stakeholder capitalism, ESG metrics movement has been incredibly helpful in getting people to think of non-financial metrics and think of those as also measures of success. So that part is important. I think with the disruptions that have taken place over the last year, to your point, has to some extent in some areas, in some industries, swung the pendulum back the other way. And now there has to be sort of a refocus on there are ways to deal with the current energy crisis that can have terrible implications for the long term, to John's point around mitigating climate change. And there can be measures that are put in place today that can actually allow us to leap forward. The good news is that in much of the advanced economies, there is some of the investments that can allow us to leap forward, coming from the private sector, coming from incentives created by the public sector, but less so perhaps in some of the emerging and developing economies, and that's where that next focus needs to be.
Just telling that.
Oh, hi, Mike Farish. Hello, Mike Farish, freelance industrial journalist. A lot of gloom. What are the factors, if any, that give you grounds for optimism about the future?
Sadia, we need a little bit of optimism this morning.
So I think we have to look a little bit beyond simply what is coming out in terms of what's at the top of the survey. It's very clear that wave after wave of crises, this current poly-crisis situation, it is creating an incredibly challenging environment for leaders. But let's look back also at the last couple of years. While imperfect, in many advanced economies, some of the support that was given to businesses to keep things afloat, some of the support that was given to households, while now we are to some extent paying for some of the consequences of that in terms of the inflation that we've seen over the last year, at the same time, it has kept things afloat for many families, many households, and many particularly smaller businesses. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was perfect, and certainly in many developing economies, things do look grim, but there have been efforts that have worked. Again, imperfect, but the development of a vaccine, the collaboration that took place between the public and the private sector to make that work, the distribution of that vaccine, while partial, again, impacting very large numbers of people around the world. And so there have also been examples of the efforts that have taken place. COP, maybe not going far enough, but the intention to create a future loss and damage fund for the most impacted and the most vulnerable countries. So there have also been movements forward. What we have to do, though, is learn from some of those areas that have worked and do much more of that today. The investment that is made in resilience today is critical because in this current extremely fragile environment, were there to be yet another shock like the one that we saw last year, it may be unmanageable. And so some of that medium to long-term focus on resilience across multiple systems is critical.
Caroline.
And for business leaders, I would just like to add that it's an excellent opportunity to move from risk management to more strategic resilience. And with that, connecting risk with strategy, there's an opportunity to capture really the positives and the opportunities that come with the direction of change. So staying in business, remaining relevant, adapting to a changing customer base, all of those are actually really positive opportunities if you choose to look at it that way.
John, what's on your optimistic
So I think not only these great examples like vaccine development, which show this the appropriate application of where there's strengths in business and where there's strengths in government. So harnessing the innovative capabilities of business with the ability of government to mobilize finance and operational activity to scale up production and actually equitably distribute vaccines. That was a good example of where best use of each stakeholder's capabilities really has a great outcome. I think the other things that I see that give me optimism over the year, and it feels like it's been a really grim year for the world coming out of the pandemic and then with the war in Ukraine. But actually there's been some amazing things out there in terms of democratic success. There's been a number of elections that have run well. We've seen candidates being accepted as a result of those elections. That feels very positive to me. I think we've seen the end of a long era of ultra-loose monetary policy in response to the inflation, especially in the G7 nations, and central banks acting very, very quickly to address that. And I think that's a positive. And that gives me great encouragement to see that both in the finance and political worlds and in the business world, that actually there are mechanisms that are working well to address risk.
Thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Paul Walsh, Field Gibson Media. If we take the cost of living crisis, which is seen as the most urgent short-term risk in this, from an insurance perspective, what sort of risk do you think this poses to the insurance sector, and what sort of measures can the sector take to kind of address those?
Well, let me take that one, or start on that one, and then I can hand over to Carolina. But yes, I think one of the biggest challenges, and it's not just for the insurance sector, is inflation and social inflation. So what I mean by that is that when you think about it, when an event happens, your house burns down, or your factory burns down, or you're flooded, or one of these awful events happens, which insurance is fantastically well positioned to support people with finance and good risk management advice and great claim service to get people back into their normal lives again. Actually, the cost of all the components, if you think about it, in a car manufacturing, it's been well understood that the lack of semiconductors, some of the supply chain tightness post-pandemic, and the cost, not alone the access, but the cost of these components has really gone through the roof. So the cost of actually fixing someone's car or rebuilding their house, just the price of the basic commodities of lumber and cement and so on have gone, really gone through the roof. So that's a real challenge to manage the cost of the inflation increases in terms of the cost of claims. But that is manageable, and I think the really important thing is that we're there for our customers to actually get them back to where they were before the event.
And I agree. I think the business insurance perspective on that is really making sure that your values are up to date and that you don't end up in a situation where you suffer a loss and then all of a sudden the insurance will not respond because your values are out of date. So that would be the main focus area.
Gentleman there and then gentleman there.
Thank you very much. William Goodwin from Computer Weekly. So this question is in two parts about technology. The report refers to, and it's been mentioned today, about cyber risks being more impactful potentially, or being a greater risk than conventional warfare. How might that actually play out over the next 10 years? And the second part of the question is, technology as well as being a risk, could that also be a way of mitigating in some way some of the crises that businesses and governments are currently facing, and if so, how?
Carolina, do you want to kick off with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think to your first question around how cyber warfare could look, I think there's a real risk that cyber attacks might be targeting critical infrastructure, healthcare, public institutions. I mean, there's such a broad array of different areas that could potentially impact. And of course, that would have dramatic ramifications in terms of the stability, but also, again, back to the earlier question around trust in governments and public institutions. So I think that's really something to keep an eye on. And then to your other question, which was about technology.
Are there developments that give us reason for optimism?
There are developments that give us reasons for optimism, and I think technology can play an incredibly important part in solving for some of the vulnerabilities that we see in healthcare systems, for example, or education, upskilling of workers. So absolutely. And I also think there's an excellent opportunity for collaborative efforts and public-private partnerships. So just thinking in terms of how we respond to cyber risks, and that opportunity for platform providers, cloud providers to partner with law enforcement, with governments, with insurance companies that can provide some guidance on what good resilience measures look like and what we've experienced. And if we come together and address this collectively, I think there's a much better risk of actually addressing some of those emerging threats.
John, before we came on this morning, you were talking about some of the reasons that we can be optimistic in terms of technology and some of the changes that are giving us reason for hope.
I think it depends on which sector you're talking about. If you're talking specifically about information technology, I think there's, just as Carolina was saying, there's real opportunities in, we see it with faster and more efficient semiconductors that can lead to more powerful and more power efficient devices. But I think that just creates great opportunities in terms of understanding data, collecting data, and monitoring things like the progression of climate. I mentioned it earlier about space being a new frontier, if you like. I think that's the ability to monitor what goes on the Earth and provide services on the Earth from space, whether that's communications or observation. I think that's going to transform many industries. I mean, for ourselves in the insurance sector, that makes it much easier to understand the consequences of major events like hurricanes, where the floods have happened, where to send support to help people who need that help. So I think there are real opportunities, and I think the other thing, I mean, it's slightly tricky because it's a two-edged sword, but in terms of social media and data and communicating to people, I think there's when I say it's two-edged sword, there's great to get transparency and information about what's going on from people, on the spot, and it's so different from how it used to be, many years ago, where it was just journalists like yourselves being on the spot and giving an edited version of what's going on. Of course, nowadays you don't get the edit, which is a shame in many ways, because it's very difficult for people to discern what is really the truth. And I think that's the challenge. And of course, when that gets manipulated by governments for their own purposes, that becomes even more confusing for people. But I think there's a huge role and opportunity, in fact, in the tech sector to be the group that helps drive a better understanding of what is the truth, and to help people address many of the really big issues that are out there that we refer to in this global risk report.
Nadia, anything on cyber that you want to come in on?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one more point here. I think there are a lot of technologies that already exist that could, for example, reduce food waste and increase crop yields. These are fairly basic sets of technology that exist already, but tend to receive far less investment than some of the more sophisticated, interesting, early-stage technologies. We need both, and we need investment in both areas, and especially technologies that exist already, and then actually scaling them into markets that function, actually scaling their use in agriculture or health or education or care. That's where there is a sort of collective failure of imagination and investment, and that's where a lot of the focus needs to go, because the solutions do exist.
Lady on the front, gentleman over there.
Thank you. Anna-Maria Sipilä from Helsingin Sanomat newspaper, Finland. Many people and party leaders in Finland are saying now that European political leaders have been too naive with everything, about Russia, about energy supply, about cooperation. They have been just too optimistic. So I was wondering, how do you see those, those past mistakes? What went wrong in European risky landscape, and what kind of political leadership is needed in the near future in Europe? Thank you.
That's a very good question. What kind of leadership is needed given the risks that we see outlined in this year's report? One that probably looks at both short-term and long-term risks and doesn't put one ahead of the other, perhaps.
Well, let me just maybe start with one general point. There is no such thing as 100% preparedness. And I think that's one of the key messages of this report over the last 18 years, that we have to get much better at foresight. We have to get much better at risk identification. We need to have basic aspects of resilience in place. We need to have plans ready or made ready once a shock unfolds. We need the sort of team sport mentality for many things, but I just want to make that general point. I think there is no such thing as 100% preparedness. That said, one of the key things that the report is pointing to is that we are in the midst of polycrisis, and probably Europe is one of the areas where those set of polycrises are the most visible. And so having this sort of short-term, long-term dual approach today, taking a very different time horizon on risks. It's not that we can solve today for short-term gas supplies and not think about what that means for greener energy in the future. And that is very much what leaders in Europe are doing today, trying to take that dual lens and build some longer-term solutions while trying to have the sort of short-term preparedness in place. And I think that dual lens is probably something that applies around the world. Emerging markets, advanced economies, they will all have to do this because collectively we are facing an era of turbulence and likely polycrisis for some years to come.
And if I,
I was just trying to get through our questions in our allotted time, so I was just going to pass it over to the gentleman there. But Carolina, if you want to.
No, I just wanted to add a quick comment on that, because last year's report was published before Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And looking at the risk rankings, geopolitical confrontation, I think it was ranked 27 on an aggregated view. However, if you were to look at the countries surrounding that area, the Baltics, the rankings was much higher. And what that tells us is that we need to make sure that we ask the people that actually know something about the risk. And what that implies in terms of leadership for coming years is that I think we need to have leaders that embrace diversity, that makes sure that we have different perspectives represented around the table when we talk about risk and resilience, because otherwise we're not going to be able to pick up on everything that's moving towards us on the horizon.
Come on.
Joan Arsquet for l'Echo in Brussels. In the 2020 report, a few weeks before the pandemic, infectious diseases were classified as the 10th biggest risk, and they are not mentioned in this year's report. Why?
Yeah, good question. And I think 2 months before, we'd actually gone through a pandemic preparedness exercise, which, if I remember, the forum colleague who organised it said to me, no one listened to me then. It took a pandemic for people to listen to me now. But yeah, it's an excellent point. We're warning about these things. Is anyone actually paying attention in places that matter? Sadia?
Yeah. It's one of the things that's coming out very clearly in the report, that we're at a sort of a meta risk of panic neglect. So when a risk is unfolding, lots of concentrated action, and then as other things are emerging, there's a sort of certain set of neglect. Now that's not wholly fair, because I think at the same time, one of the reasons infectious diseases have gotten pushed down the list, both today and 2 years out, is exactly because so many other things have emerged and because we are in this sort of polycrisis state. If you look 10 years out, actually infectious diseases go back up the list and higher than they are in year 0 and higher than they are in year 2. So there is concern around that, and what we try to deep dive into in the report is the resilience of health systems. Because whether it is this particular pandemic or whether it's a future health crisis, it's clear that health workforces are worn out. it's clear that overall the investment that has gone into trying to just sort of keep things moving is not quite the same as what needs to happen in terms of building out future health systems resilience. And many parts of the world are facing aging populations and chronic diseases and other aspects that are not quite the same as infectious diseases and are going to need long-term support. So there has to be a reinvestment, and it again ties back into the point around building out societal resilience.
John?
Yeah, I think that's, we've warned many times about health issues in the Global Risk Report over the last 15 years. From Ebola to, well, before Ebola, SARS and MERS, Ebola in 14, 15. And as Adrian was saying, that had an impact because there were organizations like the Global Vaccine Alliance and the Center for Epidemic Preparedness put in place to help organizations like the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control in individual countries to actually deliver the right information as to how to address infectious diseases. And I think that did work during the pandemic. It was in a lot of countries, there were some political challenges in the sense that not everybody wanted to listen to that very good advice from those organizations. But eventually, yes, we did get the vaccine development in place. We did see incredible collaboration in the pharmaceutical industry in particular to look through their long lists of drugs to see whether any of them would have some effect on reducing the symptoms of COVID-19. So I think that all of that is still in place, but I think it's very only natural for people once they feel the problem is solved, and especially when they've got other issues just straight in their face like the energy crisis and the food crisis, to kind of think, okay, well, we've got that sorted. But as Sadia was saying, I think over the long run, what we've all learned from this pandemic is that pandemics don't just come and go. They come and go and they come back again. And so we should be prepared for that.
Carolina, do you want to comment on that?
I think it's a very astute observation, and I think it is human nature to look at what's exactly in front of us. But the risk is, of course, that we're not learning the lessons from this pandemic that we've been through, and that we might not even be out of the woods of yet. I mean, just look now when China's opening up. We don't really know what impact is going to be on that. So as a risk professional, I'm always concerned about the things we don't pay attention to. So I agree with you. We need to pay attention to pandemics going forward as well.
Let me just get a sense of if there's any unanswered questions or hands that have been up and haven't had a chance to come back to before we draw things to a close. Gentlemen there, and perhaps Laurie again. Yeah.
Hello. Further question is just about climate change and the role of central banks. Yesterday, Jerome Powell, the governor, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, talked about central banks needing to stick to their knitting and concentrate on monetary policy in terms of price stability. And it seemed that it was taken as a pushback against the idea that central banks were to be involved in climate change. I wondered if any of you thought that was an irresponsible thing to say.
Well, let me perhaps pick up on that one. It's without doubt incredibly important that financial regulators and central banks in all countries have front of mind their key statutory tasks. In many places that's macro and micro prudential oversight, making sure that companies are solvent and are going concerns, and that at a macro level that doesn't systemically affect not only the economies of their countries that they're based in, but in a global sense. And that's partly the role of the Financial Stability Board, which was set up, as you know, after the great financial crisis in 2008. And in addition, there's another set of important roles for regulators and central banks around consumer protection, and that's also extremely important. So but when you think about a risk like climate change, I think it was very clear that after the Paris Agreement, when the G20 finance ministers got together and thought about, well, okay, how's the transition going to work, and what are the systemic consequences of these changes in the global economy to move towards a low carbon economy, it was very clear to see that some sectors and some companies could be really, really badly affected, and it could also have a big systemic impact on the financial system. So I think that's why central banks took it upon themselves as a result of the work that the FSB instigated with the setting up of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures to get companies to disclose how they were going to manage the transition. And so investors and other stakeholders could make decisions on how to finance the different companies. Because of the systemic impact, I think it is important that central banks have an overview or a sight of some of those systemic consequences which really feed into their macroprudential responsibilities.
Question just there.
Hi, it's Laurie Gehring again from Thomson Reuters Foundation. I had two quick things that I wanted to know about that we haven't talked about fully yet. One is, when we have climate change and conflict and debt crisis creating this food security worry around the world, how do you see that? What do you see as effective systemic or structural ways to address that? I mean, including things like speculation and trading of some things in food. I'm curious what you see working. I know Sadi mentioned that some basic investments and things we already have would help. And secondly, around this question of sort of disinformation and misinformation, which I think gets at government trust, and is certainly behind a lot of the problems we've seen, I'd argue, including in what we just saw in Brazil on the weekend. How do you begin to deal with these kind of problems? Are they something that shows up in the list, and how tied into solving the rest of the problems are they?
Well, I think disinformation came up in 2012, 2013, back in the day as a kind of initial warning of problems ahead. Sally, do you want to just elaborate a little bit on what Laurie was talking about?
Sure. So I think one is really those basic investments using technologies we do already have has got to be critical to food security. I think second, there is obviously a need for international cooperation when it comes to providing support to countries that are facing multiple crises. So for example, just this Monday, the support that was given to Pakistan with food security crisis, with climate crisis, with a number of things that have come together and obviously facing a high amount of debt distress, that kind of support needs to continue. But I think in the longer term, I would really just go back to that focus around using technologies where they can be deployed and where they can be invested in to build overall much more stability and resilience. Around your question on misinformation, disinformation, societal polarization has continued to increase. It continues to creep up in the list of risks overall across various timeframes, and it is dovetailing with misinformation and disinformation, and it's very clear that those two things are feeding each other and creating sort of a new emerging polycrisis there. One of the other aspects that comes out is just how extreme that polarization is becoming. There is less centrism, there is much more division, and both sides are becoming extremes regardless of the specific political spectrums in both autocracies and democracies. So that is very much coming out.
Carolina, you touched on information warfare, and we've seen some state-sponsored activity on issues from vaccines to climate change kind of coming into it.
That's right, and misinformation and disinformation are huge issues, and it actually made me think about the social erosion angle of it and how it impacts trust in governments again, and the role that private companies had to play all of a sudden, because what happens is that the public is looking to private companies for answers and for information that they can trust and believe in. And I think that's definitely something for businesses to keep in mind in terms of their reputational risk and the responsibility that they carry, because it looks very different today comparing to just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. John, I mean, one of the most effective strategies, presumably, for any state actor is to destroy the enemy from within rather than from without. I mean, are you seeing misinformation, disinformation as being something that's going to rise up the risk list?
Yes, I think it's it's part of the geoeconomic warfare and the cyber warfare. I think that's clear. We see before any major conflict a cyber pre-war, if you like. And in fact, I think it must have been about 4 years ago, NATO actually had a war game to prepare for that kind of event. I just wanted to pick up your point about, or your question about food and food security as well. And I think that's a really important one from a climate perspective, because about 30% of global emissions come from food, and we have, or agriculture, and we have more than 8 billion people on the planet since the end of last year, and that's growing. And so it's an enormous challenge to create enough food to feed everybody. And we see that one of the major breadbaskets of the world becomes inaccessible, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine. Then that creates tremendous challenges. So I think there's a huge opportunity to change the way we feed the world. In the past, there's been this huge focus on yield and an oil-based agricultural system with pesticides and agrochemicals driving yield. And actually, I think there's a big shift moving now towards quality and more locally sourced food. And it kind of goes with changing supply chains, if you like. So it's not entirely a global world. It doesn't make sense that you go to your local supermarket and buy a product that comes from 20,000 miles away when you can have something that's local and seasonal. And I think we watch so many celebrity chef programs on TV nowadays. I think there's it sounds a silly thing, but I mean, actually changing people's habits of what they cook and how they cook and how they feed their families and how they source that food, and being more concerned about how farmers and how the agricultural system as a whole operates. I think there's great opportunities there to build greater food security into the global food system.
Thanks, John. I think we're nearly running out of time, so we could probably have like a one-word response.
Yes, just one. Judith from Agencia F, Spain's international news agency. What could leaders do to reduce the risk of economic warfare and the proliferation of conflicts in the next decade?
Probably a one-line answer from each of our panelists.
I think there has to be a renewed focus on trade and investment and cross-border investment. One line.
Global collaboration around systemic risks and really capturing that opportunity to work together.
I might be quite old and I remember the Beatles, but I think the phrase would be give peace a chance.
Thanks to everyone for joining this morning for the briefing on today's 2023 Global Risks Report. Thanks to Dow Jones for hosting us here in London. Thanks to John Scott from Zurich, to Carolina Clint from Marsh, to my colleague Sadia Zahidi and her team who prepared the report. You've heard a lot about polycrises this morning. I hope we can all emerge in 2023 out of the polytunnel. And with that terrible pun, I will say thank you very much, and I hope to see you in Switzerland next week. Thank you.